the Eastern Church, the Church of the Eastern, the part of the Eastern Empire. Now, I have to confess to you, we've just had two world-class scholars in speaking to us about church history from a global perspective, and I feel so inadequate because this class holds pretty much true to its title, which is Christianity and Western Culture. And really, so many of us know so little about the church outside of the Western context. The first step to learning about this broader picture would be to learn something, for crying out loud, about the Eastern Orthodox communion. Then once we know something about that, we could push on further east to the Church of the East, or maybe even the Nestorian Church in the Chinese context. And it's been said that there are more books written on, there are more quality monographs written on Augustine's theology than there are in English. More books in English, quality monographs on St. Augustine's theology than there are on the Church of the Eastern Orthodox Communion. And I think that's probably true. And I haven't given adequate time to the Church of the Byzantine Empire in this class. I suppose it's justified given that this is Christianity and Western culture, but still, I wish I could do more for you. Let's start at least with that. Now, one of the way we're going to enter into this conversation, though, is through a study of early Christian art. Christian art is extremely important to the Eastern Orthodox Communion. And so I will begin with a few slides of early Christian art. I remember speaking with Kosta Milkov, some of you who may have met if you were in the global theology class of last year. I'm not sure if any of you were there or not, but Kosta Milkov, a friend of mine who was at one time the IFES leader, that's the International Federation of Evangelical Students, leader for the country of Macedonia, and being in a country, Macedonia, just north of Greece, of course, very fluent with the Eastern Orthodox context. And I remember we were sitting in Hungary, in Eger, Hungary, waiting for a conference there and having some coffee. It was great to see him again. And he was he'd spent some time at Oxford University, which is where we got to know each other, and then he had returned to Macedonia and was sort of grieving about the inability of evangelicals to understand the Eastern aesthetic, which I am certainly very guilty of. But in that conversation, as he was working through that and trying to help me see the importance of a Christian aesthetic, he was opening my mind to the way that Eastern Orthodox look at theology generally. I think, of systematic theology as being philosophically based and operating out of philosophical categories. And there's certainly a lot of value in that. If I can make a caricature here, in the Eastern Orthodox Communion, theology is much more prayed. It's driven out of a form of worship rather than a philosophical exercise. And that has deep implications. Have you been to a divine liturgy? I've been to very few. The divine liturgy is what the Eastern Orthodox Communion calls their Eucharist or their Mass, their worship service, if you will. It's an intensely aesthetic experience, right down to the bells and smells and the incense that you'll be smelling, the icons you'll be seeing. It's an intensely rich sensory experience. And that's not something that we really exercise ourselves in. Maybe the younger generation more than mine, I don't know. But that's something that often strikes us as very strange. Why is that? What is this emphasis on the visual, on the aesthetic that is so part of Eastern Orthodox theology? If you've heard people give a lecture on Eastern Orthodox theology, even the beginning part can sometimes be disorienting for us. Kosta Milkov, again, came into our global theology class last year, and I think this lecture he may have given to us in a former edition of Christianity and Western Culture, and began giving a lecture on Eastern Orthodox theology. And rather than talking about the things that I would have anticipated that would have come up, soteriology, Christology, this sort of stuff, he gave us a sketch of an Eastern Orthodox church and what the theological significance was of each part of the worship service. That's a very different approach to Christian theology. All right. I was interviewing Andrew Louth, a man of Russian descent who spent a number of years teaching in the University of Durham. He's a Russian Orthodox theologian, and he was explaining to me that Western theology, to speak in general terms, is the theology of the university. It's a theology that's generated in a classroom environment. That's where we foster our theological ideas. Eastern Orthodox theology, Professor Louth was explaining to me, is the theology of the monastery. It's the theology of a communal prayer. That's where theology is born. The liturgy, what's going on in the divine liturgy? It's meant to represent heaven, the very throne room of God as portrayed in Revelation. So it's just a very different approach to Christian theology. Now, I think this is the right place in the course to give a quick excursus on early Christian art. We haven't necessarily given enough time to this yet. It would be part of a larger discussion of iconography. Let me see how far we'll get. What is the earliest Christian art that we have? What are some of the earliest images representing Christianity that we have? The very earliest Christian art that we have is underground, and that speaks to the nature of why it's been preserved so well for so long. Some Christian art, the very earliest, is going to date to the 2nd century AD, and it's going to be in the catacombs, hence underground, literally, sheltered from the elements and best preserved. Now we have some indication in literary sources about the symbol systems that early Christianity appealed to. We have small clues here and there. And of course, this early theology of symbolism and these early symbols of Christianity will eventually grow into this more full iconography tradition. What do we have here as far as earliest Christian symbols? Well, Clement of Alexandria, a church father writing down in Alexandria, Egypt at the end of the 2nd century, reports to us that there was a whole number of symbols that would be appropriate for Christian jewelry. So Christian women, and perhaps men too, would put these symbols on their rings, for example. A dove was an early sign of Christianity, or a fish, a ship, an anchor. Some of these were the most famous and most common symbols of earliest Christianity. Of course, the cross was not early adopted as a symbol of Christianity, and I think you understand why. It would have been a very gruesome image to those who would actually witnessed crucifixion or whose societies were familiar with that form of execution. So the cross took a few years for it to be identified as a Christian symbol, or for it to be the most common Christian symbol. Here we are in the catacombs. Some of these date to the early 2nd century AD. This is the catacomb of Priscilla, believed to be named after the wife of the consul Acilius, who became a Christian and was killed on the orders of Domitian. So this Christian woman here was martyred at the end of the 1st century, and her catacomb, she was a noble woman, her catacomb named after her. And inside this catacomb, this is the Greek chapel, or the Capella Greca. Inside the catacomb of Priscilla, this is one of the earliest Christian churches that we have. It's a very small space. Of course, it's underground, so everything has to be excavated, makes the space very expensive. But this is one of the earliest Christian images that we have. Now, let's see. Okay. Some scholars have argued about what this picture actually represents, and I'm not an art historian, so I'm going to have to sort of bow out of that conversation at a professional level and simply give you my amateur opinions. But what does this image seem to be a reflection of? What is this depicting? What do you see? Shoot, please, Joel. Good. Presumably, this is a Madonna and child. Exactly. This is the Holy Family, presumably. And we're not sure if that guy in the background is Joseph or not, but what's going on there. But right, that would seem to be the case. And if so, this would be the earliest visual representation of Mary. Good. What do we have here? Seems to be the Last Supper. Good. No, I've heard clever arguments for why this isn't the Last Supper. Frankly, of course, we don't have a contemporary plaque telling us what this is and who wrote it and what it was meant to be. So in a sense, there's not going to be a scientific way to verify what this represents, but most of us, when we look at this, think clearly we see the Last Supper. Right. This would be... seems to be that, probably there with Jesus in the middle and the disciples on either side. So these are, again, some of the earliest Christian pieces of art that we have, even if we disagree slightly on what they represent. What's this? What's this? What's happening here? Seems to be. What's happening? What is this a representation of? Did I hear? Somebody got an idea? Give it your best shot. What do you think you see? Yeah, please. Is it the three wise men? What do you think, scholars? Anna? Most of us are going to conclude that. This looks like the three children in Greek tradition, so-called, Daniel's three friends who were thrown in the fiery furnace. Now, why would this be a symbol of Christianity? Why would the early church celebrate that story particularly? Why would they identify with that? Please, Luke. Probably. We assume so, right? This is the story of how God saved the faithful friends of Daniel from a fiery death. He could do that again in a context of imperial persecution. One would think so. Good. This image this is also from the catacombs there at Priscilla, but it's an image that we're going to see through a lot of early church history. It's called the Orrans, and it's meant to be a symbol of prayer. It's a woman holding her hands up in prayer. She has a prayer shawl over her head, you can see, and hands held up is meant to be the proper gesture for prayer. So that's why also, I mean, it sheds light on the Pauline verse too, that he would that men everywhere would lift up holy hands in prayer. That's how you prayed back then. So, and this Orrans, a woman with her hands elevated, is going to be a common symbol in early Christianity. Good. Charles, was that a question? That's a good question. That is a good question. Yep. Why wouldn't the fourth person, the person of the Son of God, in the story of Daniel appear in this as well? To symbolize, no doubt, God's presence with those in persecution. That's a very good question, Charles. Good. And sorry, I don't have an answer to that. All right. I had the privilege of visiting the catacombs once, so I'll show you just a couple pictures from there. We actually weren't supposed to take any pictures in the catacomb, but once we got out, my wife said, "Look what I took." It's like, sweet, honey. So I will share those pictures with you. Here you can see entrance to the catacomb. There was a chapel down underground where, now this was, I think, the only one that she snuck, but where we were able to celebrate communion. And this was common. There were groups coming through, I don't know, every hour or something like this in various rooms in these catacombs where they were celebrating communion. And you could hear echoing through the halls, different groups singing different languages. So here's like a bunch of German tourists, and they're over here singing, having their worship service. And then you could hear over this. Yeah, it was an extraordinary experience. And here we were. You can tell I'm a little technologically challenged myself. I've got the paper Bible open, and there's Brian Litfin, my analog in Chicago, reading the scripture from his cell phone. All right, here's another very celebrated store of images of early Christian symbols. Icons at this stage aren't developed, but there's already a growing theology of symbols. There's already a growing continuity of these early Christian symbols. This is a very early piece, 270 AD, and it's a sarcophagus. Sarcophagus is a Greek word that literally means flesh eater. In what that it's a coffin, as it were, but it's a coffin that you would lay the body of your deceased beloved one in this coffin, and then after a year or two, the flesh would be consumed, hence the name flesh eater, and you could gather their bones into a smaller storing center. So this is the sarcophagus of Santa Maria Antiqua, and it dates from 270. Now, scholars, put on your thinking hats. Why is that extraordinary that this coffin would be this early? Braden? You're down the right track. You're down the right track. This is pre-Constantine, so we don't have a very large noble class that are loudly professing to be Christians, right? That will take another 100 years for wealthy people to commonly profess Christianity. And a sarcophagus of this sort would be a very expensive project. Would take a skilled artisan, I don't know how long to produce, but a very long time. And so to have this is really a gem and a storehouse, as it were, of early Christian iconography. What do we have here? Well, what do you see? Who's this center? Who's in the center there? What is this? What do you see? This is the Orrans. This is the woman with hands lifted up who's praying. So this is a generic symbol of Christian prayer in the center. All right, who's in the center now? A shepherd. Who do you think that's meant to represent? Is that the good shepherd? Probably. Yeah. Very interestingly, you can put this up. In fact, I'm sorry I don't have a slide, but you can Google it quickly. Go ahead and Google an image of Apollo with a sheep, and you can see that the classical depiction of the god Apollo looks very, very similar to this form. Many art historians will note that these earliest forms of Christian art copied extensively classical forms, and that really shouldn't surprise us. I think those who exercise themselves in art know without any doubt that you learn by copying, and that there's sort of this evolution of artistic styles that takes place in a larger community. Only geniuses, in fact, not even geniuses, develop new artistic styles from nothing. There's always this transmission of visual ideas. And the Christian artists were clearly copying off of older masters as well. So I suppose the lesson in all of that is that we shouldn't be surprised that Christian films are a little bit cheesy yet. The industry will get going, don't worry. But right now, there's just, many have complained that it's sort of a lot of copied affair. Well, guess what? So was earliest Christian visual art of this sort as well. There's always a continuity in visual medium. So there's the Good Shepherd. What do we have on this side? This panel is very interesting. What's the story, the biblical story that's being told here? I'm sorry the images are so far back. If you get on YouTube and look at the broadcast on your own computer, you can probably see it better. Joel? Bingo! After showing this slide to 4 or 5 classes, I've never had a response that quick. That's excellent. Yes, this guy who looks totally like a Greek god down on the floor here with his curly long hair and incredible biceps and six-pack, that is Jonah. Probably not the image that you had of this Hebrew prophet, but okay. And then that thing that looks like some sort of I don't know, demonic sea serpent is the big fish, presumably. Yep, so you can see him there in the middle. And the ship, you can see rounded to the corner off the side. Yeah, that would be the ship that was headed to Tarsus. And it looks like that sea serpent has just belched up Jonah up onto the shore, and he's landed there on the shore, now about to head off to Nineveh to carry out his gospel proclamation. The depiction of Jonah, I think, is one of the highest, most popular Christian symbols up to about the first 4 centuries. So up to that time, you'll have the fish competing for perhaps most popular symbol, and Jonah. Why would Jonah be such a popular Christian story to depict in the catacombs? What do you think? Why would Christians strongly identify with the story of Jonah? Somebody got an idea? Braden, go for it. Presumably that's it. Exactly. It's a symbol of the resurrection. Given Jesus' own teaching of the resurrection and what that means, this is exactly that. And so it's a symbol of Christian hope, and that they would place on sarcophaguses or in the catacombs in hope of the resurrection of their beloved one. Exactly. Good. Now, that dates from the 3rd century. We see a number of Christian symbols there. I also wanted to show that early Christian art was copying other visual symbols and visual languages from classical art. Here we have a piece of graffiti that is one of the earliest inscriptions, I think actually I believe the earliest inscription or epigraphic evidence for earliest Christianity. There's quite a bit of debate on how early this is, but it's carved in a plaster wall near the Palatine Hill in Rome. So this is dead center Roman capital in antiquity. Generally thought to be the earliest pictorial representation of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, it's not a pleasant image, so forgive me that, but it's worth exploring here just for a moment. And you can see here is a traced out copy of the same image that you have here in a photographic form. And what we have here, I'll take you into the text so you can see it. The text says Alexamenas, that's a man's name, Alexander. You can see it, A-L-E-X, as it were, M-E-N-O-S. Of course, those are Greek characters, and I'm giving you the Latin equivalent, but so be it. And then sebete, or worship, theon, and you can see theon there too, for those of you who know a little Greek. That's theta, epsilon, omicron, and a very clumsy nu there. So, Alexamenas sebete theon, or Alexander, worship your God, as it were. So, it seems now that this man over here, with his hand raised in worship, probably is Alexander. He's worshiping, and who is he worshiping? Well, this man on a cross with a donkey's head, presumably Jesus. This is not this was not from the point of view of faith that was diagramming this. It seems to be some sort of naughty Roman who, in an act of jest, has carved this up on a wall. So it's not from a standpoint of faith, but it probably is the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross, and this is a donkey's head, so this is very clearly meant to be a not flattering image. But so be it. These are some of the earliest pictures, epigraphic evidence that we have of earliest Christianity. Now, do you have any questions about that per se? Here again is the traced out version of what you're looking at. Did I see a question? Nope. Okay, great. You can interrupt me at any time. Let me talk to you about some of the earliest Christian churches, because they will have for us some of the earliest Christian art that we have. And how early are these early Christian churches? Well, some profess to date to a very early date. Now, I'm still not sure what I think of this, but here is the Domus Patriot Copernum, which claims to be Peter's house, a church that was built in Peter the Apostle's house. I struggle to buy that. That seems extraordinary. However, I could cite lots of Hebrew archaeological sources that are going to attest to the probable authenticity of this as a very, very early church, even going back to the 1st century. We know that by the 4th century, this was an established place of Christian worship. There was a Spanish nun, Egeria, E-G-E-R-I-A, who takes this marvelous pilgrimage in the year 381, and she's tracking all over the Holy Land, what we call the Holy Land, and she describes this church here. She says, in Copernum, the house of the Prince of the Apostles has been made into a church, its original walls still standing. So we know that at least from the 4th century, and no doubt this was already an established place of Christian worship up to this time, the Christian community venerated this space as the house of the Peter the Apostle, and it just might be true. Again, lots of archaeological sources in Israel claim that that probably is authentic. If so, extraordinarily enough, this is the house. Now this, you see this octagonal church here underneath an, so actually I think this is an 11th century church, and that what you see there, the octagonal church, I believe that's an 11th century church. Above it is a modern, you can see the beam, the concrete beam there of a modern Franciscan church. Underneath this layer is meant to be a 4th century church, the one that Egeria saw, and underneath that is meant to be the house of the Apostle Peter. That's pretty sweet. Here's the 11th century walls. So here is the model of what you're looking at, and the shaded area there is meant to be the original house of Peter. There's a baptistery that was built nearby that again dates to a later date. Wow, if that is possibly true, then this is the place, this is the actual physical space where Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, as recorded in Mark 1:29. The opening miracle that we have in the book of Mark is with the crowds pressing to try to get Jesus, and Jesus is healing Peter's mother-in-law. And then also remember that the 4 friends of this paralytic man lower him down through the roof because they can't get to him. That would have all taken place here if this is actually Peter's house. Good. Okay. Whether or not that actually is authentic, here's a site that we're pretty sure is authentic. This is the church at Dura Europa. It is, again, a storehouse of early Christian art. It dates to about 180 AD, something along those lines, and hails from modern-day Syria. The location here for where Dura Europa would be is right about the middle space where the green and the gray come together. So this is a space sandwiched between the Roman and the Parthian Empire. And it was in a space. Dura Europa is a Greek city on the Euphrates River. It's founded by the Seleucids around the year 300 BC. And it's an area that's traded hands between the Romans and the Parthians a number of times. In 116, Trajan takes Dura Europa from the Parthians, and you remember that this is about the time when the Roman Empire was at its greatest geographical extent. In 121, the Parthians recapture the city. So during the time of the church that I'm about to show you, this would have been an eastern city. Dura Europa is the earliest Christian church that we know of, freestanding church. So the Greek church and some of the other places in the catacombs not standing. Dura Europa is the oldest Christian church that we're sure of. And let me show you a floor plan here. Okay, so here's a floor plan of the church of Dura Europa. I visited a reconstructed model of it. The real church I've not visited, but the whole thing has been shipped over to Yale University. I understand that's where it's housed. It's not very big. This is the doorway where you enter over here. And they had a reconstruction of it in Trier, Germany in 2007. I was there. They were celebrating the 1700-year anniversary of Constantine marrying, I forget exactly whom, but somebody who hailed from Trier. So they had this marvelous museum and all these things set up celebrating ancient Trier. And they had there a replica of this space. So I walked in the replica here, and this doorway is really thin. So I was like, kind of have to squeeze your shoulders to get through there. And then you move into this little corridor here, which is a, I don't know, little coat room, ancient coat room or something like that. And then you come into the main courtyard here. And this main center space was open air. So that's a courtyard in the middle of the building. It's not really an enclosed space. Over here is the main church sanctuary, and that whole main church sanctuary, to my memory, is not very big, maybe 30 feet long. The whole thing could easily fit on this stage, maybe 30 feet long and 12 feet wide, something like that. So if you know, about the size of a really big living room. And so I don't know how many people you can pack into that. You could probably fit 100 people if you really, really squeezed in, but who knows how many they would actually have for a time of worship there. And it looks as though it was modeled after the synagogue. There was an altar space here, where presumably you would hold the books for reading and so on, and you could have people listening, sort of like a lecture hall, listening to the Word of God preached over here. What is this little space over here? I don't know. Is this like a mother-infant room or something? Or, is this a Sunday school room? Or I don't know what was going on over here, but some sort of secondary room that would be used presumably on a weekly basis. And then the reason why this is such a sweet space for those interested in early Christian art is because in this corner over here, there was a baptistery, room number 3 over here. And this baptistery is really not very big. Here you can see again another floor plan. Here is a picture of the baptistery, and I only saw a replica. This is a picture of the original baptistery. On this baptistery, again, this is from the late 2nd century. We have some very early depictions of Christian worship. That baptistery really confused me when I was looking at this back in 2007. Now, since then, Professor Jensen has helped me understand that probably the way baptism was practiced at this time would be you'd have the person stand in the water, and then maybe they'd scoop water over your head. Remember, we're talking about Syria, so water is not a very water is a hard to find resource. It's a precious resource out in Syria. You're living in a desert. But you can see the museum curators have put up a water pot, where maybe there was one in antiquity as well, and you'd pour water over the person being baptized there standing in the water. Now, with this, around in this baptistry, we have the set of rich mosaics giving us a visual depiction of earliest Christianity and their form of worship, the aesthetic that's coming through these images. Well, here's one. What is happening here? What do you see? Please, Joel. Yes, this is the Good Shepherd. I'm sorry I have no way of marking out that, but do you see the figure on the left? There's the Good Shepherd with the sheep over his shoulders, and that looks like a flock of sheep there to the right. Good. I think you must be right. Here's another picture. What is this describing? What do you see? Bless you. Got an idea? If you see it, say it. Yeah, please. What is this? You got it? What do we got? Yep, and remind me of your name, I'm sorry. I'm sorry? Okay, I don't think so, but you know what? We're not going to be able to prove it one way or the other. What do you got there, scholars? Yep.
Could it be the man carrying the mat?
That's what most people think. Yes. Now, the confusing part about this image is that you have to, like in comic book form, have to imagine that there's a time element taking place in the picture, right? Because you've got 2 beds there. So you have 2 people, or probably not. Probably what's happening is you see the man at the top with his hand outstretched in a healing gesture, healing this paralytic, and then he gets up and carries his bed away, right? As a graphic depiction of the Bible story with Jesus healing the lame man. Good, very good. What is happening here? It seems to be something like that. Who are these folks? Well, actually, let me get to these folks here. This is probably your biggest clue. What's this? Aha! Yes, that's probably what's happening. You have the disciples back in the boat, the fishing boat. You have Jesus down there standing on the water, hand outstretched, and fortunately, well, I guess unfortunately, we can't see what Peter's expression is, but probably he was very afraid because this is where he's sinking into the water and Jesus is pulling him back up out of the water, right? Good. Excellent. So these are some of the earliest Christian visual depictions of Christian stories. There are themes that emerge. They're all scriptural stories. They're all stories that clue us into. Many of them speak of resurrection. Many of them speak of a hope of an afterlife, whether it be the three children in the fiery furnace, or the story of Jonah, or even this story too of Jesus pulling Peter out of the water could be interpreted as a sign of the resurrection. So these are some of the themes that we have in earliest Christian art. Now there's one other church that I wanted to show you here too, the ancient church at Megiddo. This is something that's been in the works for about 10 years almost. It was in 2005 that I think they made the original discovery of an ancient church. There was a prison system that was building a new wing in Israel, not far from Tel Aviv, I believe. And in the construction, they came across this site, which was discovered to be an ancient church. And the real surprising element is that this ancient church was not far from a military encampment. So that raises all kinds of interesting questions for scholars. What was the relationship between the earliest Christian community and the Roman army? We thought, from having read Tertullian in the 2nd century, that there would have been a very distanced relationship. But in fact, were there soldiers who were Christians and professedly so, going to worship services and so on in the Roman army? This discovery raises those questions. Now, archaeology, the work of archaeology goes very slowly, so the final results of these studies, as far as I know, are not in yet. But here's what we know thus far. They've reconstructed what seems to be a small but very clearly Christian space of worship. Here you have, again, it looks very much like a synagogue. You have the altar in the middle, which probably would have served as a podium for reading of books and so on, and then you have a space around it for the worshipers in the background. Here's an overhead view of what you're looking at, and you're looking at marvelous mosaics. I understand that some of the prisoners helped with the archaeology, and here they are clearing off some of the tiles. There's the beautiful mosaic in the middle of two fish. Why was the fish a symbol of earliest Christianity? Do any of you know that? Why was the fish a symbol of Christianity? Yeah, Luke, you got it? Yes. Okay. Yep. Echthus. So I'm not trying to turn this into a Greek lesson, but very quickly, this is the word for fish. So it means fish in Greek, and it became what do you call that? An anagram? Not an anagram. It became an acronym. Thank you. For, and I'll just give you the English, Jesus Christ, Thus, God's Son, our, that's added, there's no Greek equivalent to our, but our Savior. So that's what that stood for. But then there was more than just this, the fact that ichthus could stand symbolically for this larger Greek phrase, Jesus Christ, God's Son, our Savior. But also other Christian theologians speak about the importance of the fish on its own as a symbol of the incarnation. So Augustine, for example, in The City of God, is writing about this Christian fish symbol. He's the earliest one that I know of who gives a clear exposition, a literary exposition of why this was an important symbol for Christianity. But he describes it this way. He talks about just as the fish which can descend down deep into the water, just as a fish can do that. So it was Jesus Christ who came down from heaven to live among us. The depths of the ocean seem to represent the depths of the abyss of this mortality, and Jesus entered into that for our sakes and became incarnate. So that's some of the imagery floating around this idea of a fish. Also, Tertullian, he gives us another exposition of this, a little bit shorter, but he does touch on the fish symbol as well, and he describes how we as Christians are fish too. He describes the salvation that is represented in baptism, and so there's this water analogy as well. He describes how the evil one knows how to kill little fishes, simply take them out of the water or take them away from their baptism, their confession of faith. So several theologians in antiquity are playing with this idea and working out this idea of why is this symbol of the fish so significant? And it was a very common symbol of Christianity. For whatever reason, I think floating around this campus, I'm not sure if it still floats around, but some people talk about how it was a secret symbol of Christianity, and somebody on the sand of the shore might draw half of the fish, and then somebody else would complete it as a way of asking, are you a Christian? As far as I know, that's not true, but I've heard that commonly enough from our students that I thought I might want to comment on that as well. I've never seen that in a serious historical source, so I'm not sure where that idea comes from. Now, one of the interesting things is to compare these very earliest Christian symbols with later symbols that are to come, and also the Christian churches that I've looked at, to compare those earliest Christian churches with some of the later post-Constantinian churches. The comparison is striking. These earliest Christian churches that I've just showed you are tiny compared to the basilicas that are erected after Constantine. Again, at this same museum that I visited in 2007 in Trier, Germany, there was a wonderful exhibit. One of my favorite parts of the exhibit was a series of models of these earliest Christian churches that I've described to you. So here was the church of Dura Europa, and it was represented about so big on this particular exhibit. And then over here, after a couple other examples, we have a Constantinian basilica, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's like the size of a large dollhouse. That's like 3 feet wide and, whoa, 10 or 15 times larger than any of its predecessors. So with Constantine, with the legalization of Christianity, we have a real revolution in Christian art. Christian art and Christianity takes on a visibility that it simply never had before in the first 3 centuries. Look, for example, at the floor plan of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and some of you possibly have visited this in Jerusalem. It's enormous when compared to the Church of Dura Europa. And it's a basilica. What is a basilica per se? Well, a basilica is a building, means house of the king, effectively. And it was a standard building in Roman antiquity. The Christians did not invent the basilica. Rather, this idea of a political building, a basilica, is adapted to the purposes of Christian worship in the 4th century after Constantine. The basilica is a huge building. This is dangerous, but I will try. The basilica is a huge building in Roman antiquity with a series of columns here holding up the center of the building. And it was a court. It was a courtroom, effectively. You'd enter the door here and come down, and the whole building was designed to give you a sense of awe as you approach the potentate sitting back here holding court. That's what a basilica was. And you can look on the Roman Forum and find examples of ancient basilicas that predate the Constantinian basilicas. But with the coming of Constantine comes a new purpose for the basilica, and that is it becomes a house of Christian worship. Now that theologically is very interesting because Christian churches had been modeled after the synagogue previous to this. They looked and functioned like synagogues. Suddenly, with this increased visibility and this increased wealth and privilege that comes to the Christian community in the 4th century, the houses of Christian worship take on a fundamentally different, more grand structure and a complexity and intricacy to the building that was simply not there in earlier periods. Later Christian basilicas would adapt to become very complicated affairs. You have the aisles on either side. We could speak of the aisles here on either side. This center part becomes the nave. Why the nave? That's a Latin word for ship. And the way that these roofs were constructed was essentially you'd take a ship construction, the hull of a ship, same basic building design, flip it upside down, stick it on top of your two stone walls on either side, and that's how you'd create the roof for many of these buildings. So let's look, for example, at Old St. Peter's. This is a medieval depiction. Of course, we don't know what St. Peter's looked like originally, the building that Constantine began building in shortly after 325, after the Council of Nicaea. But this is a medieval depiction of what it probably looked like, and you can see a double aisle there so that they could get an even higher roof with the center nave, and that wooden structure on top is an adaptation of what a ship would be. So this centerpiece is called the nave. You have the transept here, sort of at the cross piece, usually where the altar is in St. Peter's in Rome today. That's, of course, where it's believed to be that Peter was buried underneath. So this is the transept, that sort of the cross pieces. You have apses around on either side. Of course, in Christian churches, as the tradition develops, this is going to be east so that you can have the rising sun pour through the rose window in here, and on it develops. The Christian church develops dramatically following the fourth century. Well, very good. Here's one last example that I'm going to give you. Here is St. Paul's outside the walls. Have any of you visited this church? Any of you seen this church? It's a very special church for those of us interested in ancient Christian churches. Any of you visited it? No one? Brilliant. Well, I'm glad I get to introduce you to this. This is the church, I believe, was stood from Constantine's day, so this is 330s and onward. It's a church dedicated to St. Paul over the space where it's believed that St. Paul was buried. So we have a 2nd century description of the burial place of St. Paul. It's described that he was buried on the Ostian Way outside of the ancient walls of the city. Now that doesn't maybe mean much to us at the moment, but that's a pretty specific location, and archaeologists know quite specifically where that is. GPS tracking would have been nice, but this is almost as good. The Ostian Way, what is that? There was a number of roads going out from Rome, and the Ostian Way is the road leaving from the city center that goes to Ostia. We know exactly where that road went and where it is today. Ostia was the port city of ancient Rome. Ancient Rome was a little bit closer to the sea than it is today. The sea's retracted a couple kilometers from Ostia today, but Ostia was a port city where ships would come in and then they could sail up the goods on a smaller, on the Tiber up to Rome from Ostia, but Ostia was the main port city. So we know exactly where that road was, and we also know where the ancient Roman wall is. So when Hegesippus tells us in the 2nd century that Paul was buried on the Ostian Way just outside the walls of Rome, we know quite exactly where that is, and that's where this church happens to be. Now, so this is meant to be a church that honors the burial place of St. Paul, and it stood from Constantinian times. So Constantine built this church. It lasted from the 330s all the way till about 1823, which is amazing. These other churches, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of St. Peter's, Old St. Peter's, these other major Constantinian building projects collapsed many centuries earlier. This one made it into modern times, made it into about 1823, when some very helpful young man was cleaning the building and burned the whole thing down. Yeah. So we'll grieve that one for another 1,000 years. But it was because it was built in, it extended mostly into modern times. They were able to rebuild it with some of the same building materials and in a quite exact replica form. So the church that stands there today is very much what we believe the church always appeared to be, although perhaps in a more beautiful form. And this is what you see when you step into that basilica. Now, it's an impressive sight to any set of eyes. This picture, as it were, is taken from about this point, looking towards the open front of the basilica. And this basilica too has 3 apses. Not all of them did, but this has these 3 apses, so it takes on a cruciform shape, the shape of the cross. And then Paul is buried right in the center of the transept, where you would imagine just by the altarpiece. So this gives visitors today a tremendous sense of awe when you enter into a space like that, and at least by the form of the building, its decoration would have changed much over the years, but at least in the shape of the building, this is what it would have looked like to enter these ancient Constantinian basilicas. A tremendously awe-inspiring experience for any set of eyes. Now, let's see. Chase, do you have a quiz?
Do have a quiz, but we are not able to put it on the screen.
Okay. And are there any questions I should ask first that have come in?
Yes.
Okay. Why don't we address those? I haven't given you your second break. So let's take questions. Let's take our quiz, and we may close right there. Go ahead.
Perfect. Well, the 2 questions. First of all, when and under what circumstances did the cross become a common Christian symbol?
That is a really good question, to which I should have a sharp answer. In the 4th century post-Constantine, but what I should have and don't have for you is specific examples to illustrate earliest uses of the cross in Christian art. And I guess I need to do some homework for that. But post-Constantine, early 4th century.
And then, is there any basis for the evidence that the church that claims to be built at Peter's house really was his house?
Good. So I'm conflicted a little bit about that, because I really struggle to believe it. But all these sources that I've looked at that should know what they're talking about do indicate that this is very probably, here's the way to correctly word it. It's very probably a 1st century place of worship in Peter's honor. Now, there's no way to confirm if this was Peter's address, but the other factors in place, it does look like it was a 1st century place of worship. It was very closely associated with the tradition of Peter and with Peter's memory. Beyond that is meaningless to describe. But in other words, yes, it does look authentic. Great. Those who have visited it, whom I know, who I trust on this issue as well, say that they're also convinced. Good. Those are the only 2 questions?
Yep.
All righty. Well, Chase, why don't you administer a quiz?
All right, so I'll read each question twice, and then I'll read the question and then all 5 answers twice all the way through for each one, since it's not on the screen. So, everyone have it up on Blackboard, hopefully, or have a piece of paper out. Perfect. All right. Question 1. According to Dr. Wilkin, what did Francis call himself during his inaugural address as Pope? Was it A, Pope Frankie, B, the Pope, C, the Bishop of Rome, D, the head bishop, or E, the Pope of Rome? I'll read it again. According to Dr. Wilkin, what did Francis call himself during his inaugural address as Pope? A, Pope Frankie, B, the Pope, C, the Bishop of Rome, D, the head bishop, or E, the Pope of Rome? All right, question 2. According to Dr. Wilkin, why did Pope Francis refer to himself in the way mentioned in the previous question? Was it A, he wanted to show that he did not intend to rule over the Eastern Orthodox Church? B, he did not feel like he was worthy to be called Pope? C, the Roman Catholic Church decided to rebrand itself? D, he is very old and he forgot what he was supposed to call himself? Or E, he knew the Eastern Orthodox Church would respect him as a bishop more than as Pope? Should I read that one again? According to Dr. Wilkin, why did Pope Francis refer to himself in the way mentioned in the previous question? A, he wanted to show that he did not intend to rule over the Eastern Orthodox Church. B, he did not feel like he was worthy to be called Pope. C, the Roman Catholic Church decided to rebrand itself. D, he was very old and forgot what he was supposed to call himself. Or E, he knew the Eastern Orthodox Church would respect him as a bishop more than as a pope. This is something that Dr. Wilkin did address. Question 3. What can Eastern Orthodox Christianity be defined as? A, the theology of the university. B, the theology of the monastery. C, the theology of logic. D, iconoclast worship. Or E, anti-Christian. I'll read it again. Question 3. What can Eastern Orthodox Christianity be defined as? A, the theology of the university. B, the theology of the monastery. C, the theology of logic. D, iconoclast worship. Or E, anti-Christian. Question 4. What is likely the earliest pictorial, wow, that was a hard word, pictorial representation of the crucifixion? Was it A, a sarcophagus, B, a piece of graffiti writing on a wall, C, a large piece on the wall of St. Peter's Basilica, D, a painting on some pots sold by a Christian potmaker, or E, some early churches were structured in the shape of crosses, which eventually gave way to veneration of the traditional cross shape? This is question 4 again. What is likely the earliest pictorial, wow, I want to say pictographical. That's not a word at all. Pictorial representation of the crucifixion? A, a sarcophagus. B, a piece of graffiti writing on a wall. C, a large piece or portrait or picture on the wall of St. Peter's Basilica. D, a painting on some pots sold by a Christian potmaker. Or E, some early churches were structured in the shape of crosses, which eventually gave way to veneration of the traditional cross shape. Finally, question 5. What is the likely reason that the Syrian churches that we discussed in the lecture had a small baptismal? Was it A, the building was very small and could not hold a full baptismal? B, because they only baptized infants? C, the people in Syria are very small and did not need a Western-sized baptismal? D, water is hard to come by in Syria and they didn't have extra for a large baptismal? Or E, the Syrian church was not planning on baptizing anyone, so a baptismal was a later addition? Read this one more time. This is question 5. What is the likely reason that the Syrian church that we discussed in the lecture had a small baptismal? A, the building was very small and could not hold a full baptismal. B, they only baptized infants. C, the people in Syria are very small and did not need a Western-sized baptismal. D, water is hard to come by in Syria and they didn't have extra for a large baptismal. Or E, the Syrian church was not planning on baptizing anyone, so a baptismal was a later addition.
Great. Thank you all so much. Look forward to seeing you next week. And thanks, Palmer and Chase, for working through a difficult but very fruitful day. We'll see you all next week.